motions, which can be categorized with this house opposes motions. You then have this house prefers motions. You then have this house regrets motions. You then have this house as or actor motions. And the last one, you then have policy motions. So what I want us to do is kind of go through them one by one and see how we're able to approach them. I think a lot of the engagement we'll have is within questions. I think some of those things, I think what I'm just going to try to do is try to refresh your mind on a couple of things here and there. So the first type of motion that I think is incredibly important is policy motions. Our policy motions are your typical, this house would, this house will, but mostly CAP teams will try to like make those motions this house would. So it is easy enough for you to spot that this is a policy motion because there's a specific thing that you are trying to push forward. And so policy motions, generally there's something that you are trying to implement at the moment. And so I think the very, very first thing you want to think about is you ought to have a policy. So if the debate has a certain thing that you are implementing and it has this house would, or many times, or few times this house will, that's a policy motion because you are implementing a specific policy. So you're implementing a specific thing that the debate has targeted you to. For example, if they say this house would ban what? This house would ban, I want to say smoking, but I've used it too much, but I'll just say this house would ban smoking. And so you are actively trying to implement a ban on smoking. And so it's important that you understand that you have to come up with a policy. A couple of reasons. I think I get asked so many questions. Oh, why is a policy important? If you're in a motion that's a policy motion and you're saying you need to implement a specific policy, you cannot implement something that you are unaware about. So many times you want to come up with a policy. You want to have a specific policy and explain how that implementation is going to happen. Because remember, you just simply can't implement something that is arbitrary. You can't implement something that we are unaware about. And so it is like very, very important that you not just talk about, oh, we have this policy. You describe the policy in detail. And obviously, I'm going to give you a couple of ways that you use when you're identifying specific policies. So I think there are a couple of common ways people do this. There are individuals who tend to have policies that are divided into models. So you have like, oh, the first part, our policy is into two stuff. The first model of our policy is going to be about ABC. The second part is going to be about this and that. So there are people who kind of and like in two different parts, in what it means, in how it will be implemented, and all those things. But then you have other individuals who look at policies in terms of like the main aspect about it as to what you are trying to achieve. So for example, in this house would ban smoking. If we were to take the first hand where we try to model our policy, I think the ideal example there would be like, oh, the first part of our policy would be actively looking at what ban looks like and what that ban would mean. So like what that ban would mean. The second part, or when you're modeling that policy, could be like, oh, what does that? So the first part is what it would mean. The second part is what it would look like. You get. So you're trying to be very, very specific in detail as to what that policy looks like, because obviously on opposition, you're going to be asked questions about, will this be implemented well? Will this be, play out well or stuff like that? So what you want to do, that you want to cater for those parts that would be contested. So a lot of your policy is answering how things would work. You get how things would work, how things would look like. So you want to have a really robust policy. And I think the important thing about these types of debates, these types of motions, policy motions, is that you have government fiat. And I think many people like struggle with government fiat. And so I think government fiat is the most basic thing. Government fiat is simply saying that Team A has the ability to presume that a specific policy can be passed. You see? So, and that is why when you understand that you have government fiat, modeling a policy becomes extremely easy. Because remember, whatever policy you come up with can be passed. If it's a motion about, I don't know, this house would maybe implement stuff on crime law. If it was a motion about, sorry, I'm trying to avoid. I am in cap of the certain tournament of AEDC, and I'm trying to avoid using motions. The motions that I have in my mind are motions with said. So I'm trying to think of other examples. Uh, but I think the principle, even if I don't choose example, the principle here is that when you're in a policy motion, you have government fiat. You have government fiat for your policy to be passed. This means when you're modeling that policy, you need to be very specific with it. You need to be very specific as to how it looks like. So, for example, if you're banning smoking, does this mean you're going to phase it out slowly by slowly? Does this mean that you're going to like close up the companies immediately? Like, what does it look like when individuals have been retrenched? Like, what do you do? These are all aspects that your policy can take care of. And this is why, for example, in BP debating, it is very crucial that a significant amount of time of the PN's speech is spent modeling how that policy looks like and how it will play out. You get? Because you're not going to get any other chance. Like, if you don't have a policy at PM, you might have well lost that debate already. And so, for example, it's incredibly important. I know I'm using rhetoric, I know I'm being repetitive, but policy and modeling the policy effectively is incredibly important. And we've already looked at how you effectively model that policy. So when you're modeling a policy, you want to concentrate on the things that are going to be in contention. So many times I get asked the question, like, oh, I came up with a policy, but you didn't value the policy or you didn't do something with the policy. The point is that whenever you're coming up with a policy, you want to come up with a policy that addresses the most contentious things. You see, many people come up with policies of things that can simply be conceded to. You get. So, for example, I think it is easy for us to concede that the government will, put a like not being able to work. And I think that nuance comes in things like framing. So I think if you begin your speech and just explain why there's a bit of tension in the OG policy because certain things are unclear, it is very easy for you to get those things in. You get? I don't think you can just come and give a whole other policy. I think if you want to clarify on certain aspects within the policy, maybe because there's a slight tension in the OG policy, very easy for you to come and clarify those things. But I think those things are kind of like at the framing level when you're in closing, when you're trying to like frame it and just explain, like why there are certain things that like maybe there's a certain aspect that the policy from OG missed out that you are trying to engage in. So I think it's very possible. I don't think it becomes the entire I don't think it becomes the entire extension only if your extension is based on that thing happening. Because I think one, there are various ways of extending on policy motions when you're in closing. I think the first thing is just proving with mechanisms why that thing is incredibly important. And that's one part I was going to talk about later on, that policy debates are heavily mechanistic because you're focusing on the how. You're focusing on how those things happen, how those things play out. So it's heavy, it weighs heavy with mechanization. So you're trying to often mechanize why a certain policy is good, why a certain policy is like good to happen, why it is necessary to happen. You see, so I think those are also ways. So I think it's very, very possible to extend on it, especially if your extension relies on specific aspects having been talked about in the policy. I think it's very, very possible for you to do it. But remember, the thing is that you just have to defend it. Remember, you have to give characterization as to why the inclusion of that specific thing is incredibly important for the debate, and then you link it to your extension. I think it's very, very possible. It's a bit of work, you're probably going to have to like do a bit of work and make it clear cut, but I think it's also good for differentiating it between you and your opening, you see. So yeah, but most of the times openings will do well, and so you probably don't need to, but in the event that you need to, you have to do that. So yeah, one last part I want to talk about in policy debate is just mechanization. So let's look at the debate like this house with ban smoking. You need to explain what you need to ban smoking, but you also need to explain how that banning of smoking becomes good to society. Because to an extent, it's presumed that you want to achieve a certain level of change in society. So that's why I say that the debates are heavily mechanistic. And what I mean by mechanisms is the how part. It's like, how do you get to this thing? Like, how are you able to achieve that thing? So I think when someone says mechanisms, just in your brain, just know they talk about the how thing, the how part, because debates have why and how. So mechanisms are just the how part. So I think many people use the lingo and it ends up getting confused, but the simplest things is the how. Like you're just trying to prove how certain thing happens. And yeah, I think probably talking about mechanization and getting into it is not my part, for today. But I think the most important thing that you need to understand is that like it's just the how part. I think I don't know the other facets I'm going to talk about, and I don't want to get into it, but that's the simplest thing. Mechanization is how. And you want to, in policy debates, it's something that you want to win on and you can actively win on. So yeah, I've tried my best to run through around policy debates and kind of give a different perspective, just use different illustration and explain it much more differently. I'm going to ask for any specific questions with policy debates at this moment. You can raise your hand. I'll take you. You can put it in chat. I'll take you. Okay. All right. We don't seem to be having questions, so I will move on. All right. I think the second specific motion motion type I want to move to is regret debates. I think regret debates are also those type of unique debates you tend to have, in a tournament, because they're a bit, for lack of a better word, I'll say weird. They're a bit weird because they have certain nuances to them that debaters end up forgetting. So, let's say this house regrets the grit narrative. So for those who don't know, the grit narrative is basically that narrative that you must push on, like, regardless. So I think it's like saying never give up. I think places this has been evident is like the Swan movie. Is also, I think, this movie about the chess lady. I've forgotten, but basically grit is like push, like like push regardless of whatever may happen. So the motion is this has to get the grit narrative. Whenever you get a regret motion, the first thing that you need to understand, whether you're in probe, whether you're in opposition, is that this debate is retrospective. You get? So what I mean by retrospective, that this debate is looking at a world where that thing, I pray and hope you share some notes from this discussion. Probably we could read that and understand better. I think you would probably ask me questions. I think that would help. You can ask me questions. But sure, I got to find out about the workshop on a short notice, but I can arrange material and then send it. But I would say it's much better to ask me questions while I'm here. It makes the interaction much better. But I will definitely double down and come up with a small brief document about everything. I'll also share links to videos that you can like watch. Because I think that there's so much vast. I brought my debate students with me. But all right, cool. All right. Yes. Just give me a second. Ugandans and handouts. No, yeah. So it's okay. So I'll say, whenever I look at this classroom debate, so the debate is presuming a world where that thing kind of did happen. So if you're saying this house regrets the great narrative, you need to think of a narrative. You need to think of a world where that narrative wasn't there. I think let me use a common narrative. Okay, let me take the hand. Yes. Yes, you can unmute and ask. Tino, you can unmute and ask. Tino. I
think they dropped off the call.
All right. We'll wait for him. So yes, I was saying, let me use a controversial example. This house regrets the narrative that all mentioned. When you look at that, so what you're trying to do is that a regret debate presumes that narrative didn't happen. You see, it presumes that narrative was never there. So, for example, that means on proposition, the world that you're pushing for is you're presuming a world where that thing didn't happen. Okay. So it's not enough to just give us reasons why you regret that narrative. You also have to paint us a picture, and this is where the word counterfactual comes in, of what the counterfactual looks like. And counterfactual is basically, if you presume that factual means status quo and the current scenario, counterfactual is like the opposite of that. And so when you're in a regret debate, the counterfactual on proposition is simply a world where that narrative didn't exist. Some people raise hands, but I think it's better you first coach and then. All right, we'll take questions later. But yes, I mean, I don't mind how it's done. I think it's much more interactive when questions get asked. But we'll move on. So yes, I'll say the counterfactual is the world where that narrative didn't happen. So, for example, the counterfactual in this house regrets the narrative that all men cheat would be a world where men want stereotyped to be cheaters. They regret the counterfactual in this house regrets the great narrative debate is not a world where necessarily people give up, but is a world where people are not persistent at their goals. Is a world where people aren't like don't have the zeal to continuously keep pushing. So they're not necessarily lazy. They still work to their goals, but they're unlikely to push when hardships come. They're more likely to like leave stuff when hardships come. That's the counterfactor. So it's incredibly important for you to always paint the counterfactual in this house regrets debate. Why? One, the debate is retrospective. Two, the debate doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is comparative. It compares that narrative to a world where that narrative didn't exist. So it means when you're giving analysis as a proposition team, it is paramount that you are comparing the two things. If it is unclear how the counterfactual looks like, it is unclear why you are comparatively better. It may be clear why you regret something, but it is unclear what the benefit on your side looks like. And I'll use the most classic example that my students will hate me for. While we're in Vietnam, it was around against our neighbors in Kenya. It was a motion about this house regrets the commercialization of sport. My students forgot to give a counterfactual and they ended up losing the debate. But the most important thing is that the counterfactual in a regret debate is incredibly important. It's incredibly important because you have to be comparative. Because debates don't exist in a vacuum. We are often comparing two different worlds. So if it is unclear what the counterfactual looks like, there is nothing a judge compares to. You get? This is why when you're in opposition, they tell you to also have positive matter, because you're not just going to win on the negative matter. Because you see, debates nowadays are very close. Debates are very close because debaters are working hard. People are improving. So it's not enough for you to do the bare minimum and just go through. You get? You need to actively, you need to do a lot, people. Like, you really need to do a lot. And that's why counterfactors become incredibly important. And so the importance of the counterfactors is that, one, the prop just didn't only give us reasons as to why they regret that thing. They also need to give us what the looks like. Because when we are comparing, what do we compare to? If there's no counterfactual, there's no comparison that can happen because it is unclear what we are comparing. It is unclear how a world without that narrative actively looks like. And so, yes, it is a burden on proposition teams to explain what the counterfactual is in their world. Yes, Frank.
Thank you. My name is Frank. I'm asking, do we handle regret motions the same way we handle prefer motions? For example, like maybe when you say, maybe this house regrets a Republican system of governance, and then this motion, this house prefers a Republican system of governance to a monarchical maybe system of governance. We handle them the same way, or they are completely different.
So I would posit that they're a bit different. I think they're similar in terms of the fact that you are comparing towards and you ought to be comparative, but I think they are quite different. Why? Notice in regret, I think you can lower your hand now. Like in regret debates, the counterfactor that proposition teams need to come up with isn't the counterfactor that already exists. You get? So you often need to coin up and explain what that counterfactor is. Whereas in preferred debates, opposition tends to defend status quo, and that's the comparative world that you are comparing with. You understand? So, like, it is much easier to appeal to the fact that the world opposition prefers in the this house prefers debate is status quo. And that's why I would say that they're usually quite different. They're not like, because for example, especially I think how regret debates have tended to happen, that regret debates often happen hand in hand with narrative debates. And so you're trying to regret a world where that narrative didn't happen. And so you're often coining up and kind of like trying to illustrate to the judge what the counterfactual looks like. It is never set in stone. That's why you have to give like framing, you have to give like reasons, you have to show why it is plausible, you have to give illustrations. So I would say that they're probably quite similar, but also different, because regret debates are retrospective in nature, whereas preferred debates aren't really retrospective. You're just imagining two worlds where that thing existed in one world, whereas in the other world it didn't exist. So like this house prefers, maybe let's say this house prefers a world with co-ed schools over a world with single schools. So like you're presuming two worlds, a world with co-ed schools, a world with single schools. That is clear cut. But when you're saying this house regrets the narrative of this, or this house regrets this happening, it is very difficult to just, it's not as easy, like the comparatives aren't clear cut, and that is why there's more room for you to be able to frame how they look like. That is why when a team doesn't have a counterfactual, a regret motion, it's like, guys, come on. Like you have the leeway to be able to paint and clarify what that looks like. So I don't know if I've been able to answer your question. So I think the simple answer is no. I don't think you handle them in a similar way. I think they have similarities, but fundamentally they're quite different in terms of your approach to them. They're quite really, really different. And so I think the first part we've talked about is why a counterfactual is important in a regret debate. I think the opposite thing there is that on an opposition team, if a prop team doesn't have a counterfactual, you call them out. You tell they don't have a counterfactual. Now, one thing I want to stop us from doing is it's not enough to say they don't have a counterfactual. You need to explain why they need to have a counterfactual. So, for example, in that debate of this house regrets the narrative of grit, if you're proving why grit is something which is good on the opposition side, you need to compare it to the word that they give you. So, for example, the counterfactual in this house regrets the grit narrative is incredibly important, because opposition would have to compare the benefit of grit over something else. And if proposition hasn't explained to us that something else, it is unclear on opposition how you are able to weigh up the benefits of having grit over a world where you don't have grit. You understand? So the counterfactuals become important in your ability to weigh up the debate. Like, how do we weigh up the debate when we don't understand what the counterfactual looks like? Yet, how are we able to compare grit to what when we don't understand that background that we have? And so the point to be taken from this is that it's not enough to call out teams. You must explain why you're calling out teams. Explain why the lack of doing something is harmful to their case. And I think in this case, the motion and the WDC manual requires them to have a counterfactual. If they don't have a counterfactual, they're already losing out. You see. Yes. You can ask the question, Cole.
All right, James. Now, just something that I wanted you to clarify. You're talking about counterfactuals, and we are looking at notions. Like if there is a particular motion, like the ones you give a narrative, this house regrets the narrative of grit, blah blah. I'm just inquiring if we have a particular motion, like this house regrets the multi-party system, and that's all. Then the motion on a narrative that hasn't happened, do they both need counterfactuals, or you are actually going to handle something that exists separately from the one that doesn't exist as government?
So this house regrets a multi-party system. So are you asking if you need to give a counterfactual in that debate? Hello?
Yes, since it's a regret motion, but then we are looking at something that exists, right? Because the multi-party system exists. Then the other one is a notion, like it's a narrative. So do they actually get to be handled the same way?
So, I would posit that you handle them in the same way. I think the counterfactual for a multi-party system is probably a single party or a two-party system, because I would think multi means many, and so the opposite of a multi is probably a two-party system. I think it goes down to what you and your partner strategically want to go with. But I would say probably supporting a two-party system, a bipartisan party system, is much better, because proposing a one-party system is actively crazy. I don't think anyone strategically would go for that. And I think you would probably have a strategy session when someone will tell you not to do that. But I think in that specific debate, you handle it the same way. So narrative, notion, I think same exact word, just how we tend to use them makes them seem a bit different. And I mean, I'm not the English student, but maybe semantically they're quite different, but I think they're quite interchangeable in terms of debate jargon. So I would say that you handle it the same exact way. You give the counterfactual and you explain why that is the likely counterfactual. You see, and that takes me to the next part of counterfactual. That you want to explain a counterfactual and explain why that is the most likely counterfactual. I think the best example is, I don't know if this was a regret debate, but it was a debate about I think it was France's exit from Africa. I think in that debate, why the opposition, there was a debate, why the opposition team won in that debate was that they explained why the likely alternative on proposition is bad. And so in the regret debate, you explaining the counterfactual does not necessarily mean you're now going to win. You need to explain why that is the likely counterfactual. Why is this true? Debaters are very uncharitable. They will paint for you a counterfactual which isn't even the opposite of what the motion is saying. So it's also true in many instances that you have to explain the likelihood of that counterfactual that you're giving. So, for example, maybe explaining why I think the likely counterfactual is a bipartisan system. So, for example, in that motion that you've given us, I mean, I think I would frame that likely counterfactual in this debate. I don't think that side of the single party system, because that's a dictatorship, and I don't think that's the burden imposed on the proposition. So the likely alternative is a bipartisan system, because a bipartisan system is much different from a multi-party system, because you still have two political parties. And I think because we're still operating in an era of democracy, so I'm explaining why the likely alternative isn't a dictatorship, isn't a one-party system. I'm explaining why it is more likely you have a two-party system that reigns in that specific region. Cole, how does that answer? Does that really, or there's something else?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
All right. So guys, don't be afraid. Notion, narrative, probably the same. And again, I think some other thing that you probably would have to do research on is narrative debates. I think they're also quite very, very specific and quite finicky, because you have like counter narratives and stuff like that, which usually the counterfactual is like the counter narrative towards that specific thing. But I mean, those are conversations for another day. But I think the regret motions, one, it's retrospective. Two, you need to have your counterfactuals. You need to explain why that is the likely counterfactual from the specific narrative or the specific notion that you have been given. Three, is engage truism in narrative motions. You're going to have to ask this question, Titus. Truism. Are you saying like they have like a true fact? You're gonna have to admit and ask the question. Time.
So I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, you're audible.
Yeah, so there are motions that probably things that are related to notions and narratives. Then debaters try to engage like truism, that this thing will happen regardless. Like they engage the truism of the notion or the narrative in its entirety, not the narrative or the notion. So please engage in the aspects of truism in relation to narrative and notion motions, something like that.
Okay, so what I'm trying to understand with the question is that when you have a narrative debate, they tend to be how the narrative plays out and then the true part of, like, they tend to be like how the narrative is expected to play out, and then the true manifestation of the narrative. And I want to give an example to see if I've understood you. Feminism had like three, it's having a fourth wave. There is the true aspect or the true notion of how feminism actually needs to play out, like the theoretical aspect, and then there's practically how it played out. And there are two different things. If you ever study feminism, you find out that there are two different things of like how it's practically played out and how theoretically it ought to play out. So are you saying that the theoretical method of how it plays out is kind of the true aspect, and debaters tend to engage the true aspect rather than how it tends to play out? Have I understood the question? Does that example kind of explain the question?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Exactly that.
Yes. So, all right. So again, I think this will happen, but I think it's. I mean, I think it's also. I think it's very. You still can engage them on that true aspect. I think there's still so many ways to engage them. So I think the first thing is to probably explain, because you see, theoretically, if there's a theory, like theoretically, if there's something, like there's some theoretical true aspect to something, and there's practically how it played out. I think the practical aspect has more impact or effect on society. So I think if that happens in debate, I would say the first thing is engage them on their true aspect. Engage them and like still engage them on why that true aspect is something. If it doesn't happen, like engage them and explain what, like rebut them on that true aspect. But I think if you get to a point in the debate where you have established that there is a true aspect of the debate and how it plays out, I think what you can say in that debate is that proposition engaging the, so even if at best, even if it's true, they have minimum impacts, you get, because not everyone engages with a true aspect, but people engage with the more practical aspect, you get. And so because people engage more with it, the magnitude of impact on your side is much more higher, so it's much more likely. For example, if I use the feminist example, in theory, the way feminism is supposed to play out is not the way it played out practically. If I engage you on the theoretical aspect, at best it's theoretical because I can't tie it to tangible impacts within society. You see, and so even its likelihood, it's less likely. You get. Whereas when you look at the practical ways feminism has played out, it is much more practical because you can identify and illustrate it within society. It means that it is much easier for you to have to prove likelihood in terms of your impact happening if you engage in the practical aspect of feminism. And so I think the simple answer is, I know it's going to happen, but one, engage them on their so-called true aspect. But secondly, I think you can also prove to the judge why the practical aspect of how that narrative plays out is the actual debate in comparison to the so-called get. Try to put likelihood in the debates to avoid us debating the vacuum, you get. And I think a team that's trying to engage the truism, they are probably is trying to debate in the vacuum. And that's why I said debaters are trying to be very, very smart for no reason. You know, like you're not trying to prove a perfect case. So I think it's much easier to call them out on that, because even if they defend that, I don't think they're unlikely to have massive impacts. I don't even think they're likely to have any impact because like it doesn't play out like that in society. So does that kind of answer the question, Titus?
Oh yes, it answers the question. It answers the question.
So man, I'm this fourth part, I am unsure. I am extremely unsure, but I think there's a possibility, because there's a possibility if you engage this truism and all the other teams side against you, you can. So I think at the end of the day, at the end of the day, I think it's what no judge is supposed to give you an automatic fourth. I don't think you're supposed to give you an automatic fourth for engaging the truism. I don't think you're supposed to get an automatic fourth. I think it's also how the debate plays out, because, yeah, opposition may not call you out and may not understand what you're saying. And so I don't think it's an automatic fourth. I think it's a give or take how the debate plays out. Because you have 4 teams. Like, I don't think it's an automatic fourth. I would argue that it's not an automatic fourth. You get? That's why you probably don't want to engage the truism. You want to engage how most people perceive the narrative to happen. That's why the practical aspect is the most important, because the practical aspect is how most people perceive the narrative to happen. So that's why you want to engage the debate based on how people perceive it to happen. Just give me a second. Someone's at my door. All right. Yes. So, I think short answer to what you're saying is no. I don't think engaging a truism is an automatic fourth. I think it is very subjective. It is how the debate plays out. But I think why you may get an automatic, why a judge may kind of give an automatic fourth is that people understand narratives, how they practically play out. If you're explaining how it is supposed to play out in its true form, people are unlikely to find you persuasive, even if you're right. You see, even if you're right, people are like, and they're unlikely to find you persuasive because they don't think that's how these things happen. So I think that's the clear-cut answer there. So yes, we're concluding like regret debates, but again, I think simple summary, retrospective in nature, need the counterfactual. If there are multiple counterfactuals, you want to explain why one counterfactual is the most likely to happen. So you want to give that a bit of time, like a minute to explain why the counterfactual you're giving is the most likely. The second thing is that, like, on opposition, if they don't give a counterfactual, you want to call them out. You want to explain. You just know counterfactual is important, because you're not just going to win on technicalities. Like, you need to explain why the lack of something is important. Because remember, and I think this is now where it gets nuanced, a team may unlikely give you a counterfactual, but may be comparative in their analysis. So a team is likely to be comparative in their analysis, and through the comparisons, it is likely for judges to understand how the counterfactual looks like. So that is why you still have to engage them at the best case, because a certain team may not give a counterfactual, but the counterfactual could be implicit in their case when they are comparing their case. So, for example, PM may not take time to explain what the counterfactual looks like, but PM may explain what the comparative looks like. Explaining what the comparative looks like can be interpreted to be the counterfactual too. So sometimes they may not explain what, like, they may not say word for word what the counterfactual is, but they may explain what the comparative in the debate is. The comparative in the debate is them explaining how the two worlds play out, and that in and of itself is also a counterfactual. So you have to be very, very careful. Some people try to be very, very sneaky, so you also, but you still have to engage them on it, and like call them out, but still engage them on it, because sometimes the counterfactual may be implicit in the comparison they make while having the debate. I hope, do you have any questions about the great debates? I think the practical is simple, basic. I think you're probably only going to struggle with coming up with the counterfactual, but the more you debate, the more you read, watch debates themselves, it kind of gets much, much easier characterizing those things. I think the last thing I'll say here that's incredibly important for both policy motions and regret motions, because in policy motions you're giving a policy, in regret debate you're giving a counterfactual, is illustrations. Illustrations are incredibly important for your framing of the counterfactual or for the policy to be believable. So by illustrations, I mean examples. I mean intuition pumps, whatever I call them. Illustrations, examples, intuition pumps. The three of those things are incredibly important because they make you more persuasive, because it is much easier for people to see how that thing plays out. You see, if people see that thing is more likely to play out with the examples you give, they're more likely to find you more persuasive. So you want to use a bunch of illustrations because they're incredibly important. All right. I'll just leave like 1 minute to determine if there are any questions about regret motions. Yeah. Again, I'll say I will share something after, but please, if you have a question, please do ask it now. Okay. Okay, seems we don't have a question. So moving on. The next motion type we'll look at is prefer motions. So prefer debates, prefer motions, whatever you may call them. Debates, awfully easy, but there's one central aspect at this motion, comparative in nature. This means that you are comparing analysis in both sides, you are comparing harms in both sides, you are comparing impacts. So it's usually, if captains are nice, they'll say, this house prefers this world to this world. You know, this house prefers that to that. If they are feeling a bit, you know, they want to make people fight, they'll say, this house prefers this. This means that many a times they counterfactual on opposition side with this status quo or you defending status quo. And I think before this question gets asked, captains are unlikely to make proposition teams defend status quo. They are more likely to have it the other way around, where prop teams are defending some new concept, some new world, whereas opposition teams are defending status quo, because it just makes for a much better debate that way. The other way around is just not, because I don't think it's the best way, but that's my opinion. But I think the trend set is that you are more likely to have opposition teams defend status quo in comparison to the other way. How do the judges or school students have to run it up? I'm not exactly sure what this question means. Times, could you please unmute and ask it? I'm unsure what it means. Clively, I don't know if I pronounced it well. Okay, they'll probably unmute and ask the question. But anyway, as I was saying, this is prefer motion. You're comparing two worlds, and so again, this is where setup and framing are incredibly. I think they're also incredibly important in other debates. So, for example, your policies in your setup, your counterfactuals in your setup. I think one important thing that you have to do in setup in a this house prefers debate is you have to make it clear what the comparative is, like how both worlds look like. So sometimes you have an info slide, sometimes you don't have an info slide. So you need to make it clear what that world looks like. Again, crucial going to be contested. You don't want to focus on things that are going to be what? Conceded to, that are going to be symmetry-sized. You want to focus on aspects that are going to be contested, things that are going to be quarreled about, things that are going to change, that are going to actively change within that debate. So it's incredibly important when you're doing this house prefers debates that you focus, when you're painting the picture of how the world looks like, you focus on things that are more likely to be contested and clarify those things at the top of the debate. You don't want those things to become an issue within your case. You want those things that are going to be contested about to be the main important things that come up in your framing and your setup. So I think these are very easy debates because the most thing that you need to worry about is, have I described how the both worlds look like? You get? Second thing, just be comparative. You want to compare how things happen in both sides of the world. I think the last thing before I get the question is, because you're being comparative, it is true that some of the harms and some of the benefits are quite symmetric. This is where it's important to have uniqueness within that chart, you see? So you need to have uniqueness within that chart. So, and you see, I think it's just true. So, for example, if the motion is this house prefers Ronaldo over Messi, it is true that both are incredibly insane footballers. You get? But it's also simultaneously true that they have all scored goals. You get? So if it is symmetric that they have both scored goals, it's important for us or for you to prove the uniqueness maybe within the types of goals that are being scored. That is why when you're engaging in the This House Prefers debate, don't just be comparative. Don't just prove why, or don't just prove like why something doesn't happen on their side. Prove why certain aspects are also unique to your side. You get? Because you're comparing two worlds. The worlds don't exist in a vacuum. Benefits are symmetric. Harms may be symmetric. What helps you from that is the uniqueness. And I believe I've already tried to explain what symmetric is. Symmetric means that it happens on either side. I think the clickbait world here for you guys to like kind of get, for those who are a bit lost, is mutual exclusivity. So because you are comparing on either side, it is true that things are going to happen on either side. You want to show that there's kind of exclusivity on your side. You know, there's some sort of exclusivity on your side. You see, so you want to focus on that, especially when your opposition claims that a harm also happens on your side and a benefit also happens on their side. You want to show that exclusivity in terms of your benefits, in terms of your harms. That's also one really crucial aspect in this aspect of debates. On comparatives in preferred motions, what comparatives is considered new in whip speeches, and what is considered just more comparative. So so I think this is specifically about new matter. I don't think so. I think if there's a new comparative coming out of the whip speech that wasn't talked about, that's new matter already, like new matter. So if the whip speech is engaging some new comparative within both those worlds, it is much, much different. If it is something that isn't expected to logically flow from the already existing comparative, I think that's like new information. To be honest, I think that's new information. I think even if you read the manual, you can see like new information is just is there a new aspect you're trying to create to the debate? That newness in the aspects. I think you're allowed to give new rebuttals. You know, you're allowed to give new responses. You're just not allowed to give matter that kind of shifts the focus of the debate. So if you're giving a comparative and it's shifting, it's shifting the debate. You know, like this if the debate was like one part, and you guys were, you know, and in your speech, you're kind of shifting how the debate is going to play out. That's new matter. Because other teams don't have that time to be able to engage that stuff. So I think the simple answer that we move on is that if whatever comparison, rebuttal, response you're giving is shifting the comparative or the chat or the clash in that debate, that's probably new matter, and you want to avoid that. You want to win the already existing clash. This is why I think the question is great, because I think this is why it reminds me that I think it's also incredibly important that you choose the most plausible comparative. So I know this prefers debate that there's so much going on sometimes, but you want to pick the most plausible and kind of rich comparative that's going to likely happen. You know, so you don't want to pick a comparative that is like unlikely to happen, or that's that doesn't have a bit of depth in it. You know, you want to pick a comparative within those two worlds that has a vast amount of, like, should I say, analysis, like has a vast room for you to engage in. I think that's the better comparative to pick. Titus, how does that answer the question? Does that kind of, you know, give?
It answers the question partially. I feel prefers motion give room for a new analysis, or probably more of extensive analysis of speeches may not flag, because the concept of logic might seem to just go unnoticed. So I think if it's just me, but then I prefer motions unless a judge really gives it time. There is that it gives actually new forms of analysis that might go unnoticed from whip speeches.
No, I totally agree with you. And I mean, I know this is outside understanding debates, but I think the understanding motion, simple thing, signpost, like simple thing, signpost. For example, from member, it's incredibly important to signpost certain things like maybe impact and renewable energy. So, for example, at the end of your member speech, it's important to signpost certain aspects that are going to come out of WIP. But I think the second thing is when you're at your WIP speech, it's incredibly important for you to also signpost where that analysis is coming to. You get, like, if you're trying to explain a certain idea he's given, that your member has given, signpost it. I know, because see, I think the problem is that we just tend to give the stuff. I think it's incredibly, that's why signpost, it goes back to signposting. Like, signpost that thing and show why it isn't new matter. Show why it is simply explanations to what came up in the member speech. So signposting, that's the thing that, like, and I think what I would say is that aggressively signpost. I do whip speeches nowadays. I do a lot of like whip DPN speeches. So my chat is aggressively signpost. I aggressively signpost nowadays. Sometimes judges don't like it. Sometimes judges get nerved by it, but like it's much better than them presuming that you had new matter. So aggressively signpost, especially if something is going to be misconstrued to be new matter. It's helping me, and I think it can also help you if you just aggressively signpost. I'm aggressively signposting, for those who don't know, just looks like being rhetorically, like just like overemphasis in terms of like explaining. So like in terms of like repeating, like you have to repeat yourself. I'm like, hey guys, this is not new matter because of A, B, C, and D. Like flag it out aggressively. Be like, hey, this is it. Like, you try to like use your rhetoric and your kind of repetition to kind of direct them in the right direction and like, this is not new matter, and I know you probably suffer this a lot while be giving work speeches, but I think that's the simplest advice I can give there. So yes, prefers motions. One, these motions are looking at two different worlds. You have to set up and frame how those worlds look like. Second thing is, at their core, they are comparative in nature. You are comparing two different worlds, and so it is important to have that like comparisons, even in the language you use. You're comparing, like you're doing even if analysis, like even the language you use should be comparative. You're trying to compare how other sides look like. They just give me a second. Someone's called. Hey, sorry about that, guys. Sorry about that. So yes, I was still summarizing up preferred motion. So they are comparative at heart, and you want to compare even in the language that you use. I know it seems crazy. I know it seems like judges should understand, but the judge is the average intelligence. Debaters world things to prove, because you are comparing, matter tends to be symmetric, and to avoid that symmetric aspect of the matter, you want to prove uniqueness. You want to prove exclusivity of your ideas on your side. And in a nutshell, simple prefer motions. Any specific questions on this house prefers motions? Give me a second. Just give me a second. All right, since we don't have questions, I will proceed. So I want to handle this house supports and this house opposes motions together. I think they have quite similar ideas, and they're the normal analysis motions that I referred to. I think these motions are not really complicated. They are often just weighing up values So when you say this house supports this thing, and this house opposes this thing, you are simply looking at like values within society. You are trying to weigh up like values within society. So I think the most important thing here is showing why it is true and why does something happen the way it happens. So if you're saying maybe this house supports what? This house supports aggressive methods of fighting corruption. You want to prove why you support those things. So there's a lot of emphasis on why, and this is now where they will tell you like analysis comes in clutch. You are constantly trying to analyze why those things are important. Again, I don't think it takes away from how, but the why aspect in those debates is really important. You know, it's really, really important because you are supporting something. We need to understand why you support that thing. Obviously, sometimes, and if you want to be very, very specific, why you support something could be on how it solves a specific problem, or how it does something, or how it does how it solves something, or maybe how it stops something. Maybe how do aggressive methods stop corruption or stuff like that, and that's why you support them. You want to focus on those things. You want to focus on the why part, But also, most crucially, these motions are heavy in impacts. So like they're heavy on impact. So you will sometimes judges, and I think it's a stereotype, but it's happened to me so many times, and I think it happens to so many people that in these debates, judges are really looking for impacts too. And so you also want to have like strong impact. So this is now why you want to spend time also proving your impacts, proving why one, you have maybe large impacts, why your impacts are likely, why they are maybe, let's say, much better, and why maybe if there are harms, those harms are mitigated on your side. So I think in a nutshell, this house supports, this house opposes, there are analysis motions. They want you to explain why you support that thing, why you oppose that thing. Notwithstanding that sometimes you get certain concepts, maybe economic concepts, maybe concepts where you must show how. So do those things. You also have to show how. I think the next thing is they are heavily won or lost on impact. So you want to prove the extent of your impact. You want to prove that your impacts are exclusive to you. So you really don't have to forget the impact. In this house supports, in this house opposes, you have to do a great amount of impact because you're going to win. Sometimes you're going to win or lose on the type of impact that you have, the extent of those impacts that you have. So you want to have those impacts there because they're incredibly important in those debates. I think it's also particularly because I think that's how I've realized most judges stand up leaning to the kind of like impact. So you want to also give them impact because remember, they end up giving you the win or loss. So you want to focus on those impacts and prove those impacts. So I think the last thing I will say is the part of proving. Many times it is common for debaters to simply just say, oh, we have this impact, oh, we have this impact, oh, we have this impact, but not prove the impact. Also prove the impact. And what I mean by proving the impact is explaining why that impact is important, how it comes about, the extent, and why it is likely. You want to explain those things the way I said. One, you want to explain how that impact comes about, you want to explain why that impact is important, you want to explain why that impact is likely, and you want to explain the extent of that impact. Why are these things important? I think it is fairly easy enough for either sides to explain that they have 1, 2, 3 impacts. You get? It's different when you prove the extent and the likelihood of your impacts. So those are kind of weighing metrics through which you explain why your impacts are much better. You get? So you want to focus on those parts, because those are crucial parts in those specific debates. Are there any questions about those debates? Because I think those debates are awfully easy and we can chat about them and then move on. Are there any specific things about those debates that we need to know? Okay. All right. Now, so finally, our lovely friend this house believes that. So this house believes that are kind of quite similar to this house supports, this house opposes debates, this house opposes debates. So I think again, like this house supports, like this house opposes, you are all right, Rachel. In a motion like this house supports the move by Ministry of Finance to cut the Parliament's budget by 50%. Can someone debate that the Ministry of Finance doesn't have the moral obligation to do so? Moral obligation. I think you'd have to explain why, like you'd have to, I mean, if they're in charge of finance, so I think you'd have to explain why that moral obligation is like really, really important, because I think it is easy to prove why they have a moral obligation. So I think it is fair enough to change the argument. Like you have to change the argument because I think that argument is very easy to disprove on proposition by proving that they have a moral obligation. And also the moral part of it is quite crazy because it's like you may not have a moral obligation, but you have a duty. Like you may not have a moral obligation, but you have a duty to it. And so like prop can also prove why you have why you have a duty towards it that surpasses this so-called moral obligation, and like if you have a duty. And so I don't think you can run that because one, I think it's very, very easy to disprove on prop. Secondly, I don't think it is very, very important. I don't think it plays. I don't think it. And this question is important because it takes me back to what I was saying in the beginning. That like you want to argue, you want to focus your arguments on the things that are going to be most contested about. And this is going to lead me into burdens. That you want to focus your arguments, your debate on things that are going to be contested about, like proper contested about. Things like the moral obligation of the Ministry of Finance aren't going to be contested, you get, because I can simply tell you that they have a duty to do that specific thing. So it's not going to really be contested. So I don't think it has a significant impact on the debate. So you want to focus on things that are going to be contested in that specific debate, and I don't think this is one of them. I hope that answers your question, Rachel. Yeah, all right. So yes, I'll still talk about this house believes that debate. So this house believes that debate are also your analysis type of motions. So a lot of the knowledge that you use in terms of because you see, this house believes that debate can also say that this house believes that aggressive methods are better for fighting corruption. This house believes that this house believes that the Greek narrative has done more harm than good. So this house believes debates come in very, very many forms. So again, I think it's important that you know that these debates are sometimes weighing values, and they're sometimes weighing narratives. So a lot of the knowledge from those types of debates kind of carries on. Obviously, we're not going to want you to have a counterfactual in this specific thing, but I think it is incredibly important that you prove the basics. Why is that thing important? How does that thing help individuals? And also focus on impacting in those specific debates. Because I think they're quite often very, very easy, and I don't think people really struggle about them. So I think a lot of the knowledge from this house supports and this house supports is kind of you really work it out. It's kind of the same thing that ends up playing out, unless you have a specific question. Unless there's some specific question that you have. All right. What's the difference between motions and fragments, and what makes a motion? Not a minute. I have seen some people say that, and that doesn't qualify to be a motion. Let's talk about how to craft motions. Hey, this is a really, really long chart. This is a really, really long chart. But I think this chart is extremely more important when you want to be a CAP member. So I'm unclear what you mean about fragments, but I think what you mean about fragments is that the fragment motion. I think that's what you mean. I don't know if I'm right. I think that's what you mean, like the fragment of a specific motion. I think what I would say is that this is incredibly more important when you're trying to become a CAP member. You need to understand how you craft motions. But I mean, I think also, I mean, some would posit that understanding how to craft motions is one way to understand motions. But I think what I would say is that, like, when you're crafting motions, you're probably looking at like current issues. So when you're crafting a motion, you're trying to okay, yes, we'll extend the conversation there. But yes, I think the basic answer is that, like, when you're trying to when motions are being crafted, they're being crafted to make your thought process to direct your thought process at a specific thing. So I think when someone means that that's a fragment of emotion, they are saying that the motion is incomplete because the chat about that specific part is not built up. So, for example, I will say, what I was discussing motion with CAP members of AUDC, and we happened to realize that that specific part was a fragment of what we wanted people to talk about. So, when you're crafting motions, you want to direct people's thought process. So, and I think that's one other thing that you need to know when you like understand emotions. That CAP members don't just craft motions that like, yeah, we like this motion, we'll put it there. No. Captains discuss motions, they weigh up those motions, they debate those motions. They want to direct you to a specific you get. So, for example, you can't be having a debate about economics and you're trying to talk about politics. That's just insanely off. You get. So you want to keep in the dimension of that debate. You don't want to overextend the dimension of that debate. You want to keep it as extremely clean and specific to that issue. So even when you're about motions, you just need to understand, like, A, do I think I am out of the scope of this motion? You want to stay within the scope of the motion. So you want to ask yourself those questions, like, am I just overthinking this motion and like I've lost the chart already? And stuff like that. And I know this tends to happen, especially when you're in closing and you're trying to look for an extension. But I mean, again, strategy talks will be talked about much later. So I think, is there anyone who has any issue about motions, about understanding motions? I think we've done and spent a lot of time on this house on policy motions, on regret motions, on prefer motions, and I think they are really you are damn, I've lost connection. Can you guys hear me? Am I audible? Have I come back? I thought I had lost connection. All right, perfect. Yes. So I was saying, obviously, there are things like hypothetical debates. There are things like narrative debates. There are things like economic debates. There are things like political debates. There are things like social movement debates. There are things like religion debates. All those motions, for you to understand them, need some level of understanding of the basics. So, for example, economic motions need you to understand basic economics, things like demand and supply and how things tend to work. You know, religion debates need you to understand how religion works and how religion functions. Social movement debates need you to understand how social movements work. So what we have done is the one-on-one on understanding motion types. To achieve a heightened understanding of motions, you also need to read more. Broaden your knowledge and understanding when it comes to such specific things, because it also plays into your ability to understand emotion. Because motions, we know every tournament has impromptu motions, so you want to make sure it's I think in 2 weeks time, 3 weeks time, I think. You want to prepare and have a vast amount of knowledge on various things, on narratives in society, politics, and all those things. So probably not, I'm unlikely to help you get now, because that's a whole other cup of sessions. Economic debates, hypothetical debate, that's a whole other session. I think this session was specific about understanding motion, was targeted at understanding like motion types and what those motion types mean when you're approaching certain debates. Understanding the content aspect of debates is a process that you can go and embark on yourself in terms of understanding things like economics. You have to understand the basics. The basics will take you very far, trust me. Yes. Patricia asks, are there this household motions that don't require policies? No, many of them would require policies. I don't know, you can't give me one, but the ones I've seen, and to the best of my knowledge, tend to require a policy here and there. Like they tend to require policy and just see how things would play out. So I think maybe the ones that probably don't is those hypothetical motions. They say that, oh, this house would take the pill, this house would do this, this house would do that. I don't think those motions really require a policy. I just simply think they require you to explain how that thing would look like. So, for example, if you take a pill, you need to describe the type of person taking that pill and like what type of that person is, what their social status, how those things affect them. I don't think you need a specific policy. So it just depends. You need a policy where there's going to be a heavy question on how it's implemented. Like you need a policy on those, like your policy needs to focus specifically on those instances where like there's a big thing on like implementation. That's why you really wanna focus on like explaining how that policy would work out. All right. I hope, Patricia, I answered your question. In international relations motions, how best do you prove the legitimacy of the actor? Like this house supports the imposition of sanctions to compel adherence to international rights. If I want to take the UN as an actor in their position, is there a need to explain its legitimacy in this particular aspect? So yes, I think you wanna explain why an actor is legitimate, but I think explaining how an actor is legitimate often ties into what the incentives look like. So, for example, if you want to explain the UN, it being legitimate, you have to actually lost connection. All right, it's back. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? All right, perfect. Yes, I was saying the question that was asked by Rachel. Yes, the question that was asked by Rachel is, I think, to prove legitimacy, you want to prove the incentive of that actor. So you want to prove what the incentive of that actor look like. So, for example, if I want to prove that the UN is legitimate, I want to. Okay, I will get to that. So, when you want to prove the legitimacy of the UN, you want to prove what the incentives of the UN are. Are those good? And then you interrogate the incentives. So, are the incentives of the UN good? Maybe the UN wants to see to it that people protect human rights and stuff like that. So, is that a good deal? Because I think legitimacy here is implying something good. So you want to interrogate the incentives of that actor and see whether those are good incentives. That's what you really want to do. Obviously, the next thing that you want to read up on those actors. So you want to read up on like basic actors, like international organizations, like major countries and major powers, how they act, like social movements and how those social movements react and what are their incentives. You want to read up on those things so that you have kind of a wide knowledge on them. But yes, you want to concentrate on incentives to prove the legitimacy of that actor. And you want to not just say their incentives, you want to prove that they have good incentives, because legitimacy in debate tends to imply that something is good. So you want to analyze that those incentives they have are good incentives for individuals. Please, may you clarify for me the mechanisms of good fragments of debate? I don't quite get the question, but I think the question is around mechanization. I don't think that they're inherently good mechanisms or bad mechanisms. I think how you tend to sell them in the debate determines whether they are good or they're bad. This means that whenever you come up with a mechanism, you want to come up with the strongest explanation for that mechanism. Again. And I think it's going to just take us into burdens. So when we talk about proving burdens, I think the first thing you need to ask yourself is, what is a burden? A burden is that thing that you need to prove for us to believe the argument. So even mechanisms, like when you have a mechanism, there is a burden that you must prove within that mechanism for us to believe that mechanism. So for example, if you're going to talk about a mechanism like choice, the burden in choice, I think I will probably have opened up the session, but I think I just want to ask, for example, if you have choice, what is the burden that you have to prove in choice for us to believe you? You get? One, I think you would have to prove to us that choice is a good thing. You get? Like, you have to prove to us that choice is a good thing. You have to prove to us that people can exercise that choice. You get? So I think that's the first thing that there. So those are the burdens that you have to prove within that make of choice for us to be able to believe you. If you prove to me that one, people can exercise choice, and if you prove to me that exercising of that choice is a good thing, I am more likely to believe that choice is a great thing, and that we must weigh it highly. You see? So I think it just goes down to the fact that you need to be able to explain to me, to prove the burdens within the mechanisms. And the burdens are those things that are going to be usually contested about. Contested about, you will have to prove it. That thing is going to be like that thing that's going to be contested. Like when we argue about choice, someone's going to argue that, oh, hey, I don't think people can exercise choice. I don't think choice is a good thing for people to exercise in this instance. So I think the first thing that you want to do is you want to prove the burdens within the mix, within the arguments. You get? So I think that's the kind of simple answer I would give. So you want to prove those burdens. And again, I think there's no easy way of understanding burdens. It kind of becomes more intuitive and it happens subconsciously as you go on. But one way for you to look for them is that you want to look for that thing that's going to be challenged in the debate. That thing that's going to be challenged specifically. And also, secondly, that thing that when you prove it, people will believe you. You see, so what you want to do, you also want to ask your partner. You want to ask your partner, okay, hey, if I tell you that we're going to achieve change, what do you think I must prove to you for you to believe me that change is going to be achieved? You see, so you also want to run it through your partner and ask them what you ought to prove for a specific for a specific argument for it to be believable. You get? So that thing you have to prove is your burden that you must fulfill. You get? And usually it's like at this point, the argument level, that's what you have to fulfill to be able to do that. I hope I've answered your question, Carls. I feel a bit confused by it, but I hope I've answered it to some extent. Rachel, in the promotion of human rights, UN has apparently engaged in violation of human rights during their peace operations. Doesn't this prove that they aren't legitimate? I mean, again, I think what will happen in that debate is that you would have to prove why they have violated more rights and they have saved. You see, so it's a thing of an actor may have a specific incentive, but you also have to weigh up that incentive. You get
James, I think we lost you. Okay, all right. James, we had lost you shortly. I hope.
Sorry, it's my network. It's all on me. I was just about to try to connect using my phone. So I was answering Rachel's question about, she gave an example of why the UN has bad incentives. I think again, it's where the debate is at. You know, you're going to prove why maybe their incentives or the examples where they have done well supersede over the ones where they have done poorly. You get, so it's where the debate is about. You're going to argue a bit on its incentives. You want to show so in this debate you may try to prove the extent of the good things that they have done. You may say that, okay, hey, they have done more good things than they have done bad things. You see, so that's where the debate is. You kind of play around with those things and try to prove maybe why, or they have more good incentives than they have bad incentives. It's where the debate is at. Yeah, I hope I've answered your question, Rachel. So I think as I conclude, I know people are tired. Burdens are just, you want to focus on those specific things that are going to be contested. And I think burdens appear in two types. One, there's the burden of like, there's a burden of proof you're going to have at the case level. Like maybe if you have that this house would ban smoking, your burden as proposition is to prove why banning smoking is a good thing. You get, so that's your burden at the case, your BOP of the case. Then there's the burden at the argument level. So it's like, if you want to prove that's if you want to ban smoking and say that, oh, want to ban smoking because it has health implications on people. The question then becomes, how am I able to prove that thing? And I think there are two sides to it. One, you have to prove why your side like solves or mitigates that specific issue, or kind of like I would say solves that issue. Like, how do you solve that specific thing? And there's also the comparative part of like, oh, how does it compare to side opposition? Oh, how does it compare to side proposition? So I think that's the most basic thing. I think when you're proving the burdens of an argument, oh, well, when you're proving the burdens of an argument, you want to specifically prove why, one, your thing solves the problem, and then you do the comparative of why the other side doesn't solve the problem. I think it's just remember that debates don't happen in a vacuum. Proving that something is good on your side, you need to prove why it's maybe bad on the other side. So I think the moment you forget, that's like a golden rule. Don't forget it. Debates don't happen in a vacuum. You're interacting, you're constantly interacting. Arguments are interacting. So you also need to do the comparative of why one side is either much better, which is probably your side, and why one side is much worse. So guys, unless you have any specific questions, I do think we've covered why want to understand motions and how you understand those motions, but also we've covered like proving burdens. And like proving burdens, I think the simplest thing here is that you want to prove the why part and the how part, you know. And the general aspect of identifying burdens is that you want to identify the burdens through determining those things that are going to be in contest. You don't want to focus on the things that your opponent can simply concede to, can simply say they are symmetric. You want to focus on those things that are going to be in contention, that people are going to argue about, that like going to argue with your side about. Those important things that you want to focus your time on. But other than that, I will just say give it for like 3 more questions. If there are no questions, I hand back to Enoch and we call it a day. All right. I don't think there are questions. I just want to say thank you for having me. The Uganda University Debate President's Council. Thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me this chance to chat to people about debate. I love debate, and my number will be put in group. I'll be tagged. If you want to reach out to ask a question, you can always reach. And my email is simple: okukujamesjr@gmail.com. So you can also reach out. Yeah. Other than that, thank you so much, and I will hand over to Enoch.
All right. Thank you very much, James, for sharing with us about the art of debate motions. So kindly react with your favorite emoji to try and express gratitude for our facilitator today. I love this one. All right, yeah. So James, thank you for giving back to the Uganda debate community. Okay, so I see TJ on call. So perhaps Sir TJ could say a word or two before we end this call. Mr. Joseph Tahinduha, you're welcome to say something before we end the call. Sorry for that. My PC had shut down. So I was welcoming Mr. TJ to say a word or two, then we can call this off. Okay, as he prepares to come on board, so we want to thank you for attending up to this point. We have another session at 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. It's going to be facilitated by Coach Toby, and it's going to be on the art of framing and argumentation. You really wouldn't want to miss out. So charge your device, get some data, and at 7 we shall be back. We shall use the same link. Thank you. If Mr. TJ is not in position to say a word or two, we can leave the call, end the call. Thank you all.